Hello and welcome. I'm Paul Kilmer, Director of Public Programs at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. We're so glad to have you back with us for another online version of Spotlight on Design. I'm so glad to welcome the museum's interim executive director, Brent Glass. Dr. Glass is Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, a national leader in the preservation, interpretation, and promotion of history. Dr. Glass is a public historian who today provides management and consulting services to museums, historical organizations, and cultural institutions throughout the United States and in other countries. His most recent book, 50 Great American Places, explores the power of essential historic sites and how they illuminate core themes in American history. As director of the National Museum of American History from 2002 to 2011, Dr. Glass led a 2-year, $120 million renovation and the development of major exhibitions, including the Star-Spangled Banner and permanent galleries on transportation, military, and maritime history. Since 2011, Dr. Glass has served as a senior advisor to more than 70 cultural and educational institutions, including the Presidio Trust in San Francisco, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation in Illinois, the Diplomacy Center in Washington, D.C., and Alexander Hamilton's First Bank and Drexel University in Philadelphia. He is currently working with several museums, including ours, under development, including the Sing Sing Prison Museum in Ossining, New York. I'll be back to ask our speaker later with the questions that you send us, but for now, please welcome Brent Glass.
Thank you, Paul, and good evening, everyone. The mission of the National Building Museum is to inspire curiosity and knowledge about the world we build and design through critically acclaimed exhibitions and programs. We're also well known for our home in the historic Pension Building in Washington, D.C., featuring the spectacular Great Hall. And unfortunately, for the past year, we've been unable to welcome guests to the Great Hall and to our museum's exhibitions and programs. So this year, we've been relying on online platform to bring you informative, incisive, and intelligent content. This online edition of the museum's Spotlight on Design series is no exception. For more than 15 years, Spotlight on Design has featured architects, landscape architects, and designers of distinction. The series is sponsored by the Revada Foundation of the Logan Family, and we are truly grateful for their continuing support. I'm pleased to welcome tonight our featured speaker, Eran Chen. First, I should mention that Eran Chen is a newly elected member of the National Building Museum's board, and we are so happy to have him to support us in these very challenging times. So thank you, Eran Chen, for joining us. Eran Chen is the founding principal of ODA, which he established in 2007. Since then, his firm has built almost 50 buildings in the United States and is currently working on another dozen projects around the world. Their innovative design has been published in more than 600 publications in the past 2 years and have won more than 50 international design awards, including those from the American Institute of Architects. Eran graduated with honors from the Bezalel School of Art and Design in Jerusalem, where he serves on the board and is a guest lecturer. He is a frequent speaker on design and development forums around the world and is a professor at Columbia University. Recent projects include the renovation of the former Post Kantoor in Rotterdam, the creation of Denizen Bushwick in Brooklyn, and the recent $2 billion master plan for QNS in New York City. Please join me in welcoming Eran Chen. Thanks for joining us, Eran.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glass, for the warm introduction. I'm humbled and happy to be a new member of the National Building Museum in DC, and thank you everyone who's joining us today to spend the next 45 minutes talking about my favorite subject, architecture. I think that it's hard to talk about architecture today, these days, without the context of COVID. And we all know that coronavirus has shook the very foundations of our cities. But while some of us are predicting the end of the cities, I actually believe quite the opposite. In fact, I think that the next 15 to 20 years could be remarkable for city living if we see the opportunity. It could lead to a renaissance of urban living, a new future for us as its citizens. And I think the question is, for all of us, can we step back with confidence that cities are going to prove themselves resilient and appealing, and think in what ways we can bounce back stronger and better as a result? I think we must look at history for clues. If you take London, for example, the time of the Great Fire of 1666, resulting in creating building codes that led to fireproof construction, or the cholera epidemic in the mid-19th century that led to cleaning up of the rivers from the open sewers and the birth of modern sanitization. Then came the tuberculosis and helped the birth of modern movements in architecture, the big windows, the sunlights, the terraces. And the last major pandemic, the influenza in 1918 and 20, really created deserted city centers, face masks, lockdowns, and quarantines. But it also hurdles the social and cultural evolution of the 20th century, the big public gathering spaces, department stores, cinemas, and stadiums. So every one of these consequences, the fireproof construction, the sewer, the parks, modernism, they would have probably happened anyway, yet each crisis kind of hastens and magnifies the inevitable progress. Now, I strongly believe this is our time to ask what is inevitable for us, what architecture changes should be considered as making better cities for all. So what I'd like to do today is kind of share with you my own prediction of what I see already happening in city, and how certain elements of architecture can improve our lives, the future of our public spaces, and how in addition, as a result, we can increase quality and equality in our cities. Let me start by saying that the trajectory of our office, ODA, as an office, was in small building blocks. What started in a small studio apartment on the Upper West Side expanded to multiple thinking tanks, about 100 people and international practice. We designed, as Dr. Glass said, over 50 buildings in New York City alone, and work around countries around the world and in many states around the country here in the US. Now, our thinking process, or before I get to this, you see a diversity of the projects from small to large and in many different sort of typologies. Our thinking process, just like our structure, was always in building blocks, thinking about how cities are made up from small units of life, while operating independently, also kind of share common community. We break down the city into small components of intimacy that work together to make a greater whole. As we start to conceive our buildings and our neighborhoods and areas in the city, we start in small blocks that are intimate and then unite things to get bigger and bigger and bigger. I do believe that one of the biggest challenge of modern cities today is that they've lost their progressive scale of intimacy, which makes them kind of increasingly austere and contributes to the feeling of isolation. You're either alone in a big building or you're with a million others on the streets, and something I think we're all feeling right now during this pandemic. So at ODA, we kind of try to sort of, like our structure and like our process, we like to look at cities in sort of in their fractal nature. And when I say fractal, the term fractal was coined by a mathematician called Benoit Mandelbrot in 1975. In his work, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, He defines fractal as kind of fragment geometrical shapes that can split into parts, each of which are almost identical to the reduced size copy of the whole. Or in other words, you can say that fractals are similar patterns that are similar across different scales. So they're created by simple kind of repeating over and over again, ongoing sort of feedback loop, if you will. Research by a number of groups supported the theory that fractal elements in nature and beyond are stimulating emotional reaction by human. And clearly the brain has a preference for fractal structures and feel relaxed, free, safe, and in ease in social environment. Now, trees are a good example in nature, and they're very much fractal phenomena. You'll find this kind of fractality on every level on the forest ecosystem, from the seeds to the pine cone branches and leaves. But also rivers, like this is the Myanmar River, and it is a great example for fractal branching of patterns of river delta ecosystem. Even the Italian broccoli is another kind of delicious example of fractal geometry. Now, the use of fractal in architecture goes back through history. One of the recent strong examples is Frank Lloyd Wright. Palmer House is a good example, and many other projects. What's interesting is the use of triangular, in this case, in 9 different scales, where from the floor pattern to the furniture design, to the structure, the rooms, the larger room, the garden, even the sort of the house itself, is a repetition of the same element in different scale. And perhaps part of the glory around the work of Frank Lloyd Wright is not only the beauty of its fractality, but also the sense of calmness that it possesses. A few years ago, we were asked to convert an old factory building in Dumbo to a Class A office building on the Hudson River front. The building was described by the owner as the ugliest in Brooklyn, but it's actually located at one of the best locations in Dumbo, which is also a landmark district. The building used to be a sugar refinery factory, and it was built in the 1800s by Brechtel brothers. And as you can see from this kind of picture, the building was double the size, where half of it was demolished in the 1940s. Now, from the get-go, we were very intrigued by the fractal nature of sugar as a crystal and as a component of building design, which led us to design, first of all, the lobby, where we used kind of the sugar crystal as a pattern for the flooring, then the walls, then the reception desk. And as you can see at the back, sort of the 3-dimensional wall that is made of stone. But we didn't really stop there. And when we had the design to design a facade that is facing the river, we chose the same kind of a fractal pattern as a 3-dimensional facade system to create a new facade for the building. The facade is made of unitized glass, steel system that fits together like a puzzle and repeat in a way that expresses not just the narrative about the history of sugar within the building, but also it creates a fractal patterns that reflects the farther context of the building, from the bridge, the river across, and the park right across from it. Now, architecture can be fractal not only through geometrical forms taken from nature, which obviously is beautiful, but also as a component of human interface. We can look at a social fabric of cities, for example, as a fractal system of generic form of interactions that multiplies, creating a growing cycle of intimacy, starting with the nuclear family, our home, then our community, our building, our neighborhoods, and then the entire city. And here is a very, very interesting picture of Bilia village in Zambia. These traditional villages are made up of reoccurring clusters of individual huts, which are similar to the overall shape of the village itself. The hut, as you can see at the top left, repeats itself to create a shared space within neighbors, which is number 2, and a mutual territory of a courtyard. And then those clusters repeats again and again to form the entire village. Now, beyond the beauty of this repetition, the function of sharing social space, the cluster of homes, the safe space for kids to play, and the entire village that surrounds around a courtyard is a major space for, let's say, the cattle, and creates a sense of security for the entire village. So interestingly, the sort of scaling hierarchies that governs the whole are a reflection of the social organization of these communities. Now, the village structure is done intuitively without any theories of Mandelbrot to help it, which is fascinating to me. Now, in that sense, if you were to take the huts in these pictures, and you were in theory kind of try to stack them vertically like a modern tower, no longer the village or the neighbors could share any territory at all beyond sort of the private homes. Now, in 2010, we made a small but very important discovery. We call it the flying dormers, where you look at a typical building in Manhattan, it's basically defined by what we call the street wall, the wall that it stands on the sidewalk, and the setback line, which creates what we call the wedding cake typology in New York. And what you see here in the diagram on the gray is a triangular area by which the zoning allows you to stay within the facade of the building, but it does not define where the location of these areas could find at the end within the entire facade. So we started arranging the diagram on the right. We started arranging this gray area to see if we could get something very interesting here. One, we could get more homes with gardens because of this particular configuration. But I think more importantly, the visual connection between those homes through the common territory becomes not only physical, but a visual, mutual territory for the neighbors themselves. In a way, that stacking relate to a way that a typical stacking would not accommodate. Now, this idea of a dormer that starts as an avenue of light into a gabled roof, then sort of developed into a zoning regulation, and later on into what we call the flying dormer, to us was a huge discovery. Because all of a sudden, we can look at fractality not only as a two-dimensional graphic aspect, as you can see in this facade, in this picture, but also as a placement where people can actually occupy the facade and create communities within the vertical sphere. And as you can see, each of those kind of homes relates to the others in that regard. But that discovery, which was done on a sort of high-level, high-class, exclusive housing, we really wanted to bring it into a more kind of common housing program, a more affordable option that would carry similar ideas. And what you see here is called 222 Jackson, is a rental projects in Long Island City in Queens, where we use poured-in-place concrete to create a similar language throughout the entire facade. So if you take a very simple kind of building grid and you start looking at a studio, one-bedroom, two-bedroom apartment, extending the living room, we could then control, like music notes, the composition of this entire facade, not just in terms of its visual aspect, but also in the way that it's creating those pockets, those clusters of family homes on the garden. The result is, first of all, almost duplication of the outdoor space of the footprint of, I think more importantly, the quality of extended outdoor space from one's home into a cluster of sort of a neighboring apartments. Now that idea started growing in our head, and we've done another building in Dumbo, Brooklyn. We use the most generic form of living and intimacy, a room or a living room, and start bringing them down in a composition that would create a richness of spatial qualities that would start define the verticality of our social kind of fractality, if you will. And then the discovery has brought us to be able to really control those experiences. Which leads me into a building back home where the National Building Museum is, DC, and maybe some of you from DC would recognize the building. It's called West Half, and it was completed about a year ago. It's right at the gate of the National Stadium. And again, it's kind of tackling the same topic in slightly different way. Here, we had to deal with the really large mega blocks of DC, and we wanted to create more intimate relationship, not only within the building, but between the building and the public realm. So essentially, being on your own terrace with your own garden, you can not only experience the outside, but the outside public realm can experience you. And this dynamic between neighboring buildings, a small community to the larger community of the city started to form. And so as the building trajectory is kind of stepping, as you get away from or closer into the stadium, it also creates an urban movement where the entire arch here, this is formed by the building, creates a gateway into the national park. We were really intrigued by the relationship that these buildings or these communities start to create with the public realm through the fractality from the smallest unit into the bigger scale mass. And what we always find intriguing is the balance between the urge of people to get intimacy and the urge to be connected. And here's as the building kind of tilts towards away from the stadium, it also kind of covers the courtyard and allows for the southern lights to come in deep into this communal space of the building itself. Another building in DC that is under construction right now is Parcel 8 at the Wharf. And I'm sure a lot of you know the Wharf is one of the most successful kind of public spaces on the waterfront in DC. And again, we started to examine a sort of a monolith U-shaped building into a way that he could be more fractal and interact, in this case, two pieces, a hotel on one side and a residential on the other side with a commercial space at the ground floor. And what was created is sort of a love affair between the hotel on the left and a residential on the right, where the entire slope of roof of the building is sort of occupied by its communities, and the viewpoints between them start to create a unified relationship. But I think the most kind of captivating thing for me is if you look at the right and how the trajectory of the roof comes down into the public space, we started to be extremely intrigued by the idea of a roof become an extension of the public realm and how individual building could now be major contributors into the public realm. And we had an opportunity for a project in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And essentially, this is the most central area in Argentina. It's surrounded by the Palermo racetrack and the main park and all of the best neighborhoods right by the river. What's fascinating, though, is the only way to experience all these urban facilities by driving a car, because there's no point of view that really gives you that expansive view of everything. The other fascinating thing is there's an existing parking structure on the site itself. We've been asked to design a Class A office building, and our immediate intuition was, can we now thread the needle between the sort of pedestrian and bike passageways that are surrounding the site and the building itself as an extended of the public realm? Where the idea was, how about we connect 2 points of the park to the roof and make that a visual point? The other thing which is fascinating is we decided not to knock down the building and very simply kind of do an adaptive reuse of the existing structure, but fairly minor deviations that created a new form that allowed for two elements that usually are not interconnecting to connect: a Class A office building in the city and a public realm park. And so people could come down up the ramp that you see on the right, which is right an extension of the public park, go up the building, experience the landscape roof and also these amazing views of Buenos Aires that otherwise you can't really experience, have a restaurant at the top, get a beer or a coffee, and really enjoy sort of an expansion of what otherwise was kind of a dead public realm. What I'd like to do right now is pause for a second, and I'm gonna stop sharing and join you guys. We talked about fractality in building. We talked about the quality of expansion of one's life into a greater neighborhood. And I want to talk about bigger scale. But before I do that, I wonder, Paul, if there are any questions.
We have gotten a question or two. Eran, the fractal pixelated form is nice to look at. but it's a lot of joints and corners. How do you confront the issue of the building envelope with regard to water intrusion, and such is as much thought given to the interior experience, what somebody looks out of those pixelated windows and facades?
That's a great question. I'm going to start with the last one because the inner experience is what makes this whole worthwhile. If you think of a typical apartment in any big building, they are flat facade and they have one exposure of light and air. The minute we project one of the pieces, in this case, let's say the living room, we get a few things. First of all, we've got more vantage points and more direction of light and air. And we also get this terrace that now is sort of a united part of the entire apartment, which is very different than a balcony, right? That kind of projects out beyond the experience of the home. So that creates a much more valuable and more expensive life experience. As for the constructability, I mean, we've been doing this for almost 15 years, and we have proven again and again, even in very affordable construction sites, that if you are methodological about the way you work and you use repetitive details, we can very easily address the expansion of the envelope. And the most important thing is we're designing build for the next 100 years. People are going to live there, and we have to take every care and effort, architecturally, engineeringly, and even from a development standpoint of view, to increase the quality of our homes.
I thank you. I love this next question because it is so, it really sets up the difference between an introvert and an extrovert, living in a big city versus living in a smaller city. When you talk about the shared visual spaces and community views or private views, what do you see as sort of those differences when you're designing, for example, in New York City, where, folks are, I don't want to make a broad generalization, but, where folks are seeing each other in they're living in private living environments, as opposed to, in maybe lower residential or suburban communities where curtains can be drawn and those sorts of things.
Well, I think that the whole issue of privacy in cities has been overrated for a while. It's nice that people see each other, I believe, but we always engineer a building in a way, and I'll show a few examples where one can accept privacy in their own shared apartment while stepping out to the terrace. The decision to go outside is a way of an action of being part of the overall. And I think that this is a human thing that I promote. But clearly, there are enough people who would rather live in a glass tower or somewhere with disconnected to everything else. So I want to go back to the community of New York for a second. We're in Brooklyn, and I want to share with you how the idea of fractality within individual building have grown in our mind through the years into an urban idea that really impacts all of us as a city. And the first example is this. It's a project called Denizen in Bushwick, which essentially consists of 2 city blocks, as you see in this diagram, with an inner courtyard. Denizen was a very unique and kind of revolutionary inspirational discovery for us, because we've basically been asked to design 2 city blocks as 2 separate buildings. Each of them has a courtyard, sort of a donut shape. And we started thinking about this, if you look at the diagram from the left, as more of a fractal sequence of inner courtyards that make the bigger one and the bigger one. And so what we ended up doing is demapping the street in between the buildings with the help of New York City, creating a public park that is open to the entire community at large, and then connect and interconnecting to a series of courtyards, as you see in this picture. This is a picture of half of the project. So essentially, these courtyards are a new form of public space. They're on a private land, what we call privately owned public space, but they're programmed at the ground floor to become a mix of both retail and exhibition space and community space, and they allow people from the community to be shared into a sequence of these courtyards that are highly sort of orchestrated, not just architecturally, but also in terms of their program. Now, the fact that the building has become from two separate individual private buildings to more public have triggered the idea of making the building almost like a public museum. And we reached out to 15 local artists from the neighborhoods to make huge murals on single-loaded corridors within the building that are looking outside, and to create their imprint of their vision on the entire building, which resulted in this kind of insane, arguably the biggest collection of public art in Brooklyn in this one building. And I'm sorry I didn't press the button, but this is part of the functioning area of the building itself. People's apartments are there, while they're also reflecting towards the courtyard and towards the outside. Now, the roof of all of these is about 6,000 square foot of green sustainable roof with a high level of landscaping, but also a world of communal attractions, from golf, mini golf, to urban farming and hydroponic planting. But the interlocking of all of them is what I think makes this sort of a new typology of living experience. Now, considering 20% of the apartments are affordable, we went back through the years and kind of met with the communities of the building itself. And it's really fascinating to see what type of new relationship has been formed around the building with the surrounding neighborhood. Which now leads me to the sort of the master planning experience of our firm, and where I really want to kind of insect my personal optimism about the future. What you see here on the screen is 5 city blocks in Astoria, Queens. We call Innovation Queens. It was commissioned for us to design a master plan that is really big, about 2.5 million square foot of mixed use program. And the first thing we did is we went to the community and we said, the plan needs to diverse and address the long-term needs that has been amplified in the current situation. So for example, we found that there's not enough healthcare facilities, that there's no youth and educational children welfare after school program at all. There's a huge safety problem with this neglected area right now with drugs and such. There's a core infrastructure that is missing, like bike lanes or pedestrian plazas, affordable and major need, or transportation and green space. And the first thing we've done is we looked at all of these in 3 buckets, which we think is an inclusive, sustainable future neighborhoods. The economical bucket, the cultural and social bucket, and the sustainability, the environment sustainability. All of them are what makes real sustainable neighborhoods. Now, the first move was to take 25% of the private land of the development that was meant to be built on and reduce it and dedicate it back to the community. And that 25%, which is a huge amount of open space, would not be successful unless it's programmed on very diversified and very accommodating, equitable type of program for all neighbors or members of the community. And so we've taken small local retailers and no big boxes. We've taken community facilities and art and education structures, social, senior housing, all combined into a ground floor, which is meticulously meant to be dedicated to the public realm. And so everyone who lives in this neighborhood can walk around this, and what's now just a street level experience of retail could become a more 3-dimensional pocket. And for example, if you go on 35th Avenue and you make a right into the intimate street, all of a sudden you've got this amazing courtyard, which again, to me is a grown fractality. It's a continuation of the fractal idea of the terraces into the building, now into the scale of the neighborhood itself. And it's surrounded by office and resi and art. And then the childcare courtyard where the kids' playground, an after-school music program. And as you go across towards the park, there's a pedestrian passageway with small coffee shops and ice cream. and all of them regulated to become more affordable so they can support local economy and local businesses. And then clearly the great park at the center that is supported by a cultural institution. And again, it's not just a MoMA museum, it's a cultural institution that supports education for the neighborhood and local artist exhibits, etc. So the ground floor itself should be or should not be in our mind and in our sort of vision a necessarily money maker for this development. The ground floor should be a dedicated area to expand our public realm. Here is the World Market that celebrates all of the cuisines of Queens, and then the Urban Plaza with the outdoor cinema. So my point here is that if you look at sustainability as three buckets of environmental sustainability, economical growth, and social sustainability, from affordable housing to diverse communities, you can start looking at the way of the future. And now, if they're all united and overlapped at the ground floor, then they can also grow vertically into the new built environment. I just want to point out, if you look at the building, you can start seeing our fragmentation and our tactile and fractile language. It expands into the green roofs with the roof farms and beehives and biodiversity and the green roofs, and then the courtyards that are totally public and open to all. And it starts to feel like a city that I would want to live in. As a contrast, I just want to bring that picture here, which is potentially, arguably the most expensive, one of the most expensive streets on the northern hemisphere. This is Park Avenue. And just to point out how two-dimensional our cities could be, how unfractal, flat the facades are, and how limited the public realm is at the ground floor. Now, if you take this to an extreme, it reminds me some of the more kind of forms of communism architecture was done in Russia back in the days, where you can argue that there's a mega fractality, but it's meant to have a political agenda of kind of reducing the human place and the collective interaction. And that's why we were kind of shocked and surprised, or pleasantly surprised, where we were invited to design a sort of a mega master plan for Moscow in one of the most important and central areas in Moscow City. And so the site is really big. And the first thing we thought, if you take the typology of typical Russian or Muslim towers that are built in Moscow, like towers on an open park, and you then densify them to create more intimate connection, and then cut out areas of public realm, and then create the architecture. Then on the other side, the office does the same thing. A block of office now is formed to create its own courtyard and its own placemaking. We can start talking about a ground floor loop that unites the mixed use program as one kind of fractile neighborhood that is rich in diversity of form, but it also in space making. Even the roof of the office has a series of restaurants that are interconnected, while the ground floor kind of unites programs of cultural institution, food and beverage, in and out, public spaces. And I love the duality in this rendering between what's in the background, sort of the city of Moscow, and the foreground of our building. Sort of brings me to kind of conclude this talk, and why I'm so thrilled and optimistic about the possibilities of the future. If you take a typical city, in this case, this is Moscow City, and you think of the hierarchy of the big block buildings built on a structure that was meant for cars, and you start looking at increasement of fractality and sort of intimacy in different levels, and how that fractality from the apartment can grow into common spaces on roofs and on the ground floor as united pedestrian-related areas that are open to the public. You might start seeing sort of a new way of thinking that I think it's forming not only here, not only in Moscow, but around the world. And I hope that the future of our cities would embrace those opportunities to better life for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eran. I'm so looking forward to the projects that you have in the pipeline in Washington, D.C. So we've gotten a lot of questions this evening, and I'll just kick it off with one that's very technical. What software do you use to display the fractality in the designs you make?
Well, I think that our office is probably using every 3D software that exists in this planet, from Rhino to Revit, 3D Max, etc. We're also using animation softwares to create those models that you saw, where we investigate the three-dimensional possibilities of a building. So we animate our 3D modeling in a way that illustrate what we call the breathing room of a building. To what extent even the building is such a stationary, monolithic structure, to what degree it could expand and contract as an organism, and what we can discover as it moves.
Which I'm sure is so important when you're presenting to clients, to give them the idea and the sense of, the possibility, as opposed to a static 2D representation.
Absolutely. Besides that one client that I showed him the breathing room of a model of a building, he says, there's no way I can afford the building to move like that.
So true. You talked a lot about expanding the public realm and placemaking, but what are you doing in the space of affordable housing?
I love that question. Thank you so much. Look, I'm a huge believer that affordable housing have to stop being the formula of projects of affordability in remote places that are less valuable, less designed, less engaging, less connecting, meaning we still are, and traditionally that's the way we've dealt with it. Cities have built affordable housing, what we call projects, but because there's no budget, usually the land is in the most remote locations, the architecture is not great, and I think it just cements the problem of equality through the years. I hugely support the idea of percentage of affordability on every given building, and I know it sounds extreme. We're doing most of the rental projects we're doing today have a certain level of affordability within them, from 20 to 30%. We've done Hunters Point South, which is a building by which 75% of the apartments are affordable and only 25% are market rate. But the idea is that if you do that, if you incentivize developers to build a portion of affordability within every building, wherever they build, and the incentives could be through additional height, additional floor area, now we can start talking about a more equitable city that people can live wherever they want, and only where they can afford remote from where, the heart of the cities are.
That's so important all around. What are some challenges you face or approach with regards to sustainability in your designs?
So the aspects of environmental sustainability has talked about and will continue to be talked about forever. We are now reaching an era where the building codes and most of our clients will demand sustainable buildings from an environmental point of view. And we're always kind of pushing the envelope as far as we can to reduce the carbon footprint, to create all electrical buildings, to have green roofs, to collect water. The reason I didn't point it out in this talk, because I think we all are aware of that. What I think we're not aware or less aware is that sustainability is built of three aspects, which I touched on: environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economical sustainability.
Yep.
And what we as an office are very much intrigued and sort of bullish on is really ponder on the aspect of sustainability and social and economical sustainability. So people can actually live in our cities while they're green. So people can actually be part of this amazing thing called the city and not disperse into the suburbs as we know today, which makes it the most non-sustainable thing in the world, where people are fleeing out of cities into the periphery. And then economical sustainability means that people that live in a certain area could maintain themselves economically through the local businesses and the sort of the local industries. And to that end, we're huge about urban farming. I think this is an aspect that I believe would grow tremendously, where we can grow our food within our places. Hydroponic farming has, to me, become, and just a word about that maybe, because I think it's fascinating, the ability today to create hydroponic planting indoor through LED lights, to create stuff not just on a roof plane, but to stack lettuces and tomatoes or whatever in areas that are enclosed and that are darker, and use the underutilized areas of our cities to create our own food, to have our own labor working locally, and to deliver it locally. These are the elements that I think we can celebrate in the near future. And partially, I think these elements are going to replace the failed retail that we see in our places on every city.
Interesting. There was basically a comment we got, which I think is worth mentioning, and it was simply saying mainly to developers. And
it's a very interesting comment, and I'd like to address that. When I went to architectural school, I read the book that I'm sure all of you have, The Fountainhead, and I grew up on resenting two things in life: the private sector and the developer as the elements that kind of ruin our cities and ruin our lives, and housing in general. Architects that consider themselves really great architects are striving to do museums and opera houses and public spaces. And I want to address these two elements. Number one, housing is becoming the most critical aspects of our livelihood in cities now and in the future. And we need the best of us, the best architects, the best mind to deal with housing as opposed to just museums. Not that I don't like to design a museum. Two, the private sector and the developer are the most impactful of every city around the globe right now. We used to see cities that are built by cities. We've seen failed attempts by governments and cities to build. NYCHA is a good example of public program for housing that is failing. The private sector is shaping our life. And we have a decision to make as architects. Do we resent them and fight them? Or do we work with them to make their work better for us? And I've made a conscious decision about 15 years ago. One, that I want to consolidate my efforts and my talent in everyday buildings that really shape our lives, not to resent an opera house. And two, that I'm going to find a way to educate the private sector, to work with them in a way that we all collectively can make a better impact on our city instead of just ignoring them. I hope it's a long, but I hope it's a sufficient answer.
We'll find out if it wasn't. I love this question too, because it's very forward thinking. And you may or may not have thought about it, but what are your thoughts on floating cities?
Look, I think it's ridiculous, and I'll tell you why. I think the idea, look, we have so much infrastructure that exists in our cities that needs improvement. We have old buildings that are over 60 years old. You know that 60% of the towers in Midtown Manhattan are over 60 years old? We have a major question in our minds. How do we reutilize existing structure? How do we give them new meaning? How do we not knock them down, but create a sustainable development on the foundation of what exists already? So for us to say there's no more space, we need to go and build a new infrastructure that is floating on the water. Just the thought of it in terms of the cost and to create that, to create the infrastructure that supports that. I think that it looks great and it sounds great as a storyline, but I think that I would encourage my people and architects to really go back to the foundations of what exists, and let's really think of how we can make our cities better instead of building cities on the moon, which, by the way, we can, or in Mars, might happen, but definitely we cannot talk about sustainability when we have to fly a shuttle ship to the moon to meet our parents.
What a vision of the future. I think this is a perennial when we do these our Spotlight series programs. How do you convince your clients that your design is the correct one?
Oh, that's the $1 million question right there. And I'm not joking. Look, the profession of architecture is tough because we need to convince people to spend a lot of money that they're only going to see the results far in the future. And if we think as architects that we can be very talented designers and that would be enough, that's going to be very challenging. Our ability to articulate our ideas and our ability to convince our clients to do the right thing is a very important part of our profession. But when I don't look at my client as the enemy, when I have sympathy to the ideas of building for profit or not losing money or being efficient or having cost and time of construction, it takes time. When I'm sympathetic to those and I work with them and bring new innovative ideas how they can do that while doing something so much better, it's very easy to convince. So the resentment that we as an architect feel from our client, we should look at ourselves. Some of it is stemmed from our disability to communicate that they can do better with their ambition, as opposed to they should build our ambition. That's two different things.
Eran, I want to thank you. This has been, I've admired your work from afar, and I'm so glad, as we talked earlier, I loved seeing the models that you have on your right shoulder in the background. We talked earlier about the project that's hopefully coming to Crystal City in Arlington County in Virginia, near me. But for now, I want to say thank you for your presentation. Thank you for everyone participating tonight. And for those of you who may not have, we will be editing this program, and it will be available on our website within 10 days. So, Eran, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Paul, for the invite, and thank you for everyone who stayed tuned and listened. Hope to see all of you soon.
My best. Take care.
Take care.